I've been having a long thread of textual discourse on sort of awkward topics of, or at least my criticism on sort of this new modern trend, or I shouldn't really call it that, but especially, in the time of COVID and things like that, people have been indulging and developing technologies to fill in the social gap in some sense. And it's quite interesting because when it's done through technology, in some sense, because of that extra filter, there's an extra bit of there's quite a nice juxtaposition between sort of intentionality and ease. That it's easy, but you also have to intend and to be there, to be in the shared space or something like that. And yeah, I mean, I've certainly made up my mind as to at least some judgment over some of the species of technologies, which I consider to be um, sort of evolutionary dead ends. Um, Although my commentary here will sort of, I like to use Keegan stages of development, although I disagree with Keegan probably in on stages 4 and stages 5 on the and I have a more integrated model perhaps of how these things work together, but specifically these empathy circles or communicate active listening and things like that, I think could be useful in repairing, let's say, a kind of certain kinds of self insularity, certain kinds of disbelief in being able to uh, perhaps, but essentially, I can see it as effectively repairing damage done on Keegan stage 2. The problem is that Keegan stage 2 should not be vulnerable, constantly vulnerable to being abused, because Keegan stage 2 itself is not fit and proper uh, to share with other people, except if that is the stage of development that you're on. So, like a 3-year-old child, perhaps, would sort of be firmly in Keegan stage 2, I would even say. Um, what I've spoken about in my discourses and sort of ramblings on development is that the kind of the naive narcissism which mothers promote because it's necessary um, to go and to try to engage and synthesize some kind of stable amalgamation between Keegan stage 2 and Keegan stage 3. But when Keegan stage 2 is being repaired by adults who have already had a taste of Keegan stage 4 and who are actually quite conscious on Keegan stage 4, and they are being knocked around on Keegan stage 2, and then they want to do a kind of active listening, active speaking sort of mock up, or so that they can, in some sense, this is just a kind of narcissist. This is used to repair narcissistic injury, because essentially the current cultural norm is so entrenched in normalizing narcissistic patterns of communication that then eventually you need to do a kind of a bout of active listening. Now, I do think that some people do need to be an active speaker just to believe that there are other minds out there. I think in some sense, because it's you just need to model the ability that you do have the power. It is conceivable that you have the power to uh, um, be fully duplicated in your stream of thinking, that your thoughts can have power to control others, can have the power to reach others and be duplicated by others and be reflected by others. In some sense, it's making you aware that there are other minds that you have potentially control and power over. And if you don't believe that it's possible to have power over somebody else, obviously ethical forms of power require consent, require a sort of a two-way flow. But active speaking and active listening, where you just reflect the active speaker, in some sense, it's like, having the ability to control and having the ability to be controlled, is a very important ability to have. In some sense, you can only learn about being a boss by also first, at some point, maybe being an employee first. because otherwise you won't play the other role properly. But that kind of dynamic is not really, I think, what's actually being indulged in when people are doing. I know this was called empathy circle, but I do think it is a bit of a misnomer. But in some sense, the empathy that is being modeled here is a kind of unilateral, private, um, unquestionable tone. But that is the tone of Keegan Stage 2. It is insulated. It is your private realm of belief, of your private judgment. And people do need to know that they contend and contain private judgments and that they do have the ability to affect other people, because otherwise you won't treat it with the requisite care. But essentially, the trick really is how to have a stable integration of Keegan Stage 2 into Keegan Stage 3, which is completely missing in the entire culture. It's been completely skipped over. There is no honest integrity building or development within Keegan Stage 3. What people have is they have a Keegan Stage 2 narcissistic injury and they have a Keegan Stage 4 systematicity. And that systematicity and that unilateral belief can be pale reflections of one another. You can always play this game where you say, no, I don't believe that, so I don't agree with you, so shut up. Or you can say, well, this is my system and you're not plugged into my system right now, so like this is the wrong space for you. Or this system says that this is the. So you've got two foils to express. It's like a dilemma. And so you can perform attrition on people because you can always leverage the one instead of the other. If someone tries to address the one, you can just express the same thing in the other. So if someone says, "Well, your systematicity, let's talk about it," and they're like, "No, no, no, these are my private beliefs. This is covered by privacy." Or if you say, "Well, these are my private beliefs and my private emotions, and I'm just expressing them, and you need to reflect them," it doesn't matter that like I'm sort of projecting negative. In some sense, the problem with this, and although it seems that I'm elaborating something, but I'm elaborating something that's quite culturally relevant in some sense, is that essentially between Keegan Stage 2 and Keegan Stage 4, you can make a paradox. And that paradox, so in some sense, I think that you could have a healthy form of active listening and active speaking. If you made that a practice, my caveat would be is that you can only talk about experiences that you self-directed and that you caused and that you are responsible, and you are just basically monologuing and reporting the effects that you know that your own decisions and choices were responsible for creating, so that it's innocuous essentially. Because when you get other people to reflect your let's say active responsibility paradox, or your sort of, because in some sense you can play shadow games with your own beliefs, because it's like, no, 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 this is not a belief that I have. I was just reacting because somebody else had bad beliefs. So why am I privately monologuing about somebody else's bad beliefs? Actually, I'm not talking about my Keegan Stage 2, but I am. But it's through the valence of a sort of Keegan Stage 4 systematicity. So I'm reporting a systematicity and a model of a systematicity, which is completely cerebral and hyper-rational, but I'm doing it in the medium of my own negative emotions that have been impinged on and imposed on and infringed by other people's negative beliefs. So they're not talking about their own private power, they're talking about the lack of their private power, and it's a Keegan Stage 4 projection. Okay, so you've got this juxtaposition between a Keegan Stage 4 projection, which is coming in the guise of a Keegan Stage 2, well, this is what I want, this is what I want. And what people want is important to know that they have the power to want things, and that power has the potential to affect other people and to influence other people and to control other people, and that people's wants have the power to control each other, and and that you can see, you can drill that into yourself, or not, but you can demonstrate that for yourself by doing active listening and active speaking. But because it gives the potential outline of potential control from one person to another, which is an ability that people really have, and we need to not forget that. But in the world in which no one does the work of Keegan Stage 3 development, and everyone is just hopscotching from Keegan stage 2 to Keegan stage 4, and they just have a narcissistic injury in Keegan stage 2, and they're not going through the embodiment process. They're not going through the integration of the shadow. They don't give a shit about that. And in some sense, that's been normalized. That then you're just pontificating about a Keegan stage 4 systematicity, and no one is cares about doing the work of integration, because you can just hopscotch and juxtapose my unilateral belief is not being respected enough, and my systematicity expectations have been you're being incompatible with them, or something like that. And so you're making an ethical claim, you're making an ethical accusation from the systematicity of Keegan stage 4, but the fuel is not Keegan stage 3. The fuel of this is completely Keegan stage 2, which is, in some sense, I think, being largely so I mean, let me put a stereotype on this, just to make it just to illustrate the point. So essentially, I see this kind of active listening and active speaking as a tool for the kind of the white liberal guilt culture to find a place to recharge its narcissistic injury, because it's created a toxic culture that has normalized people speaking their truth. And it doesn't matter that their truth has bundled within it all these insinuations and accusations and ideological structures, that just makes its way in through the side gate. And so you have to suspend your rational uh, uh, faculty while you empathize with the emotional charge that this ideological narrative and sort of insipid tunnel, this reality tunnel, people must see that they have the right to create reality tunnels and incept people into narratives. Now, it is true that people do have frameworks. I mean, and they should perhaps be debated, and they should be explored, and then and all those sorts of things. But that requires Keegan stage 3. That requires some level of integration of Keegan stage 3, and some kind of and so my general sort of thing is that this is helping people to not grow up. This is helping people to because in some sense there's people on well, let me just say that people don't need this active listening and active hearing. Their problem is that they don't have embodiment on Keegan stage 3, and they're going back to the outline of a potential possibility, which is in some sense, I think, the model of almost like the Führer principle, that essentially whoever gets to the soapbox first gets to sort of play sympathy tug of war and be king of the hill and sort of be queen for a day and say things that then no one else is allowed to contradict. And then you have to make sure that if you're monologuing, you don't do crosstalk or something like that. Although, I mean, I don't know, there might be variants of this practice that has a way of doing some kind of brokerage or something like that. And I mean, in some sense, I think that this is the active listening, active speaking thing is just, it could be used to repair or rehabilitate some forms of stagnation on Keegan stage 2. But there's no one that I can think in this culture at the moment that is in need of repair of Keegan stage 2. That's not the level at which that their problems are manifesting. Everyone knows that they have the potential of private power, and they're just waiting for their turn to indulge in it or something like that. Because anyway, in some sense, it's a manifestation of a culture that is ideating sort of Keegan stage 2 as that you need a canonical narrative, or you need rules that lets one person be king for a day or something like that, and then you kind of have some kind of weird game or consensus built. I mean, it's the what I'm trying to, okay, in a very roundabout way, I'm trying to say that it's toxic to the concept of trust and justice. It's toxic to the concept of substantiating and hashing things out and coming into compromise or persuasion or being convincing or negotiating. And and in some sense it replaces like actual shared values with a potential of, sort of unilateralism, which is just, I've already called it toxic. Sorry, I'm missing over a point somewhere here, but and as a practice, it is so toxic. It really is, because it makes it, I would think, impossible. Um, because in some sense it means that, well, everyone's Keegan stage 2 becomes sacrosanct, becomes untouchable, that you have to be sensitive around it. And so sort of any kind of general encoding of space into this kind of practice, if it's going to loom around, it's it's really going to make it impossible for people to actually do any real development in Keegan stage 3. Which, if I could model it slightly, I mean, look, this is the problem of Keegan stage 3. It's like, yes, it's sad that if you're a juvenile growing up, right, that you've had experiences that you haven't digested, like metaphysically, in a grown-up way. So you have all this kind of loose charge in your Keegan stage 3, all this kind, and you need to work out some kind of objective metric to eventually come down on itself, a kind of objectivism that will understand how toxic objectivism is. But unless you have an initial contention of objectivism, you're never going to, sort of like the Star of David. You need to understand that one triangle points up and another triangle points down. Um, and then you've got sort of six directions. I mean, okay, there's a symbol or whatever, but the what what can I say here is that in some sense the current culture is so toxic that it will not even allow young people to sort of embody things. They have such a brittle defensive, over defensive protection of, which is essentially anti Keegan stage 3 development. And so people have been so blasted by sort of Keegan stage 4 propaganda, which is toxic propaganda at that, because it's Keegan stage 4 that has absolutely no groundwork done in Keegan stage 3. It's sort of projected from a Keegan stage 2. And so you get this very atomized, unilateral, narcissistic premised sort of ideological, armchair, philosophical gainsaying and such. Um, and I kind of explained that before, with the Keegan stage 4, Keegan stage 2 sort of juxtaposition, hedging one to the other. Um, Now, Keegan stage 3 is, I think, the hardest. Well, I mean, it's no, yeah, it's a lot of things to say, but some sense, if you don't get Keegan stage 3 right, you really um, you should be very careful on Keegan stage 4. You should suspend too much work on Keegan stage 4, um, or you should try to sort of do it at the same rate as Keegan stage 3 at least. Because otherwise, in some sense, what the general critique that I'm making now is my critique against Keegan's view of Keegan stage 4 is just systematicity, because all systematicities are generally plugged into some form of nihilism. And in some sense, it just projects that nihilism onto somebody else's Keegan stage 2, or it says, oh, those people are stupid, those people are wrong, those people are. And Keegan does that. I presume Keegan does that himself. I haven't read Keegan's books or David Chapman's books on the Keegan stages, but I have, I think, got enough information from secondhand sources um, that the view of systematicity is pretty much in line with the kind, or is, if you think that you can get it from scientism, if you think that you can get it from the systematic view of science, I don't think that that's Keegan stage 4. I think in some sense, even these people that I'm talking about that are Keegan stage 4 and Keegan stage 2 juxtaposing, they are in some sense in a very arrested development in Keegan stage 3. They're sort of between the two, although it's kind of, I mean, that's the average, I guess, so it's hard to describe it because in some sense they're kind of seesawing between 2 and 4, 2 and 4, 2 and 4. And they won't build structures in 3 because if they build structures in 3, then they won't be able to seesaw anymore. And if they can't seesaw anymore, then they will actually, things will land, and they will be responsible for trying to land things on themselves, because then if things go over their head, then it's actually not just the other person's fault that they can just project something onto them or give some kind of snide retort or go between unilateral belief inconsistency or ideological impermissibility. Um, which are kind of like a kind of hypothetical tool set, which is just much like, the sort of the leveraging of hard skepticism, which is somewhat built in the scientific method. Well, we don't have a better method, so science must be the engine of rendering the answer and the truth, or some bullshit like that, which is usually what systematicity entails, is that you believe in some kind of canonical paradigm, which is, as far as I know, it's worthless. I mean, you're going to have to base systematicity on something that's worth basing it on, and it's going to have to be, I would say, ethics or consciousness or psychology, and in some sense that doesn't exist, or some kind of esoteric teaching perhaps, or at least some kind of Taoism or outline, some kind of cohesive, comprehensive spiritual practice that includes an active responsibility, which is not supported by science. Um, and Keegan stage 5 is just hideously described. It's pathetic. Meta fluidity or meta systematicity. It works on some descriptive layers, but anyway, I've dealt with that on other recordings. So I'm not going to go. I've already repeated too much. So what's my point? My point is people don't need to repair their Keegan stage 2. They need to stop being so vulnerable about their Keegan stage 2, which will only happen once they grow and develop Keegan stage 3, which essentially they have an aversion to doing, because then they wouldn't be able to live in the toxic narcissistic culture that has been normalized by, sort of critical race theory and other sort of proto-fascistic ideological worldviews that permit this kind of hyper-rationalism and scapegoating and sort of covert hostility and scapegoating. Anyway, what's my point? What is my point? So I was going to go on to talk about, within my model of personality, where I think the sources of the main crux of the sources of delinquency are, if I can use that judgmental phrase. Obviously, the dominant functions between the subconscious and the unconscious, and in some sense, I would say that in what I was just describing, it's the subconscious dominant function which is going to be leading the charge, and it's going to be using the unconscious dominant function as a kind of as a thorough through. And so there's direct sympathy from the subconscious dominant function, which probably has a naked translation and directionality imbued within it, with a kind of unilateral dominant function in Keegan stage 4. So you've got this kind of bypassing of their own Keegan stage 3, of their own unconscious side of the mind. They're not willing to put it through their unconscious circuitry. They're going straight into the free theta in their ego. In some sense, they don't want to see themselves as contributing to the mess in any other way than in a hyper-rational ego Keegan stage 4 perspective. They only will see themselves as contributing to the problem in terms of Keegan stage 4 sort of presence. So that essentially they don't have a Keegan stage 3 presence. They have blotted it out. And in some sense, I think that is the general strategy that these people have, because that is, quite frankly, probably what has been extolled to them by Keegan himself or by David Chapman talking about Keegan. And that is how you attain towards Keegan stage 5, essentially, is that you sort of, you avoid the pre-trance fallacy, essentially. And so in your sort of hopscotching of Keegan stage 3, so that you can just sort of skip over the trouble space, they've just found a way to kind of abrogate the developmental issue of stage 3. So it's weird because in some sense, again, I think another way of saying it is an arrested development on Keegan stage 4. And then what helps them is that they've got their parent function, their inferior function, and the sin of their unconscious as kind of like, what would you call it? It's like henchmen that are beating you with sticks, and you have to make it through that gauntlet, and they're not willing to deal with you. That they use their latter half of the unconscious side of the mind as a filter mechanism for their Keegan stage 4 ideology or their systematicity. And if you don't make it through that gauntlet, then they won't listen to you. So they've completely identified, essentially, with, they don't take any personal responsibility. They do not see their own super ego parent function. They essentially they don't even think they have a Keegan stage 1. I'm just trying to think how when I was talking to someone who is my secondary source, one of my secondary sources for Keegan stages, I think they described it as just sort of, oh man, wow, this is embarrassing. I can't even remember my definition of Keegan stage 1, at least within his model, within Keegan's model, that it's an immediate sort of bodily, experiential, I think it was something like that it's sort of the something like a visceral experiential experience. No, I'm butchering this. Anyway, that it was something like maybe the truth of stimuli. I think I might be forgetting something. It sounds, it was a very blunt and simple and and sort of, it seemed quite straightforward. It seemed quite plausible to me as well, and I'm not rendering it properly because it's not just sort of input, but it's also got some sort of sense of experiential reality. Like the experiential reality of your body in some sense. That's the connotation that I got from it. Um, but I feel like I'm describing it very poorly. Anyway, I must have made a note of it somewhere, but anyway, it's nowhere close to me now. And Keegan stage 2 is what you want, or something like that. And I basically said that is correspondent with my view of the subconscious, which is basically your belief center, and is obviously in some sense the source of emotionality. But the actual Keegan stage 3 circuitry, what I'm saying is actually very, very strange, because if I say that people don't have Keegan stage 3, I mean they do have a state on Keegan stage 3. Their state of Keegan stage 3 is unconscious metagram circuitry. So they have metagram circuitry, and they are probably incredibly this is going to sound very strange, but I mean this is what borderline personality disordered people do as well, is they will project their circuitry onto other people and onto their immediate environment, so that they can play through cycles of their metagram circuitry, so that they can get information from the subconscious to the ego through the conduit of the metagram circuitry. And so they will have a kind of experiential, and in some sense that might be why they need the act of listening and the act of talking, is because otherwise they can't press rewind and rewind the tape and then play it forward again. This is a bit of a strange, I should think of a better analogy, but in some sense the problem is that the false ego complex becomes a prison, but it becomes an even worse prison if you're stuck, and in some sense, if you haven't got an embodied Keegan stage 3, then you can't actively articulate internally your own metagram. Like more embodied people that are more conscious of their unconscious, if I can put it like that, or have more healthy states of unconsciousness. Because I mean, yes, Keegan stage 3 is unconscious. It's not nice to say that you're unconscious about things, but it happens to be true. And that you have to learn your own circuitry. And the more you learn about it, in some sense, there's a didactic sort of process that you have to, in some sense, you have to be around other people who are also interested to learn about themselves. And that when you are doing something with somebody else, when you're trying to communicate with something else, when you're trying to maybe experiment a bit or try to do something, some kind of self-exploration through, but not just naked self-exploration, that you are also there with other people and you're there with their purposes and you have your purposes. And you have to be willing to see what is happening inside of somebody else and also what is happening inside of yourself, so that there's some idea that it's not about you, it's maybe that's more about them and it's not about you. That you're not, because you can't, you're never dealing with a perfect reflection, you're never dealing with a perfect mirror. It's not like, oh well, what you see around you is just a reflection of your own internal state. That's a very crazy kind of solipsism. And in some sense that's the kind of, that's not, it's not, that's not the kind of problem that these people have. It's similar to the kind of problem that people have. That's the kind of paradox that people are projecting onto other people. So they're actively projecting that as a paradox to defend themselves from having to defend their own unconscious circuitry, or substantiate or explain their own unconscious circuitry, which is the greatest gift, really. To explore it. Obviously, there can be different kinds of settings, though. There's no way to exactly describe. There's no sort of hard and fast rule that. I mean, this can be the problem when you're dealing with too many people who are juvenile and who don't know what's going on. And in some sense, you can kind of be a little bit lucky when someone is doing something that seems objectively wrong. Like if there's a bully in the mix, like an actual bully that is not part of your class, who's part of a senior class, and then people can orientate around that. Well, what are people's different views on this, and then you can learn a lot about your peers and about yourself and about um, who does what and what responsibility people take. A medium of shared events is therefore useful for inculcating at least some confidence in the idea that one has access and parity enough to access um, yeah, I mean, you can say it's the problem of trust, it's the problem of faith, it's the problem of or the mystery of these things, uh, the mystery of justice, and how to ground it, and what it should mean, and all these sorts of things. And how people are, let's say, they don't care about leaving stones unturned, and the style in which that they're okay with leaving, the style to which they will, sort of use heuristics that are perhaps extra convenient or expedient. It's not so much in terms of the outcome; it's in terms of the process, the quality of the process of the thinking. Um, but I mean, a lot of people just don't give a damn about integrity. Which I would say is in some sense the general theme of Keegan Stage 3. I think my model of the third segment of the divided line in Platonic metaphysics that sort of has a general run through of all the different mysteries, or all the different sort of blockages and anyway, what am I really talking about now? So I was talking about the problem spaces. So the dominant function in the subconscious. Yes, the dominant function in the subconscious and a very defensive and filtered dominant function in the ego, or in Keegan Stage 4. So you kind of have a reactive Keegan Stage 4 and you have an active Keegan Stage 2, when it really should be the other way around. Um, you should have very clearly demarcated reactive Keegan Stage 2. Like, you should have Keegan Stage 2 where the lines are drawn as far back as possible, where it is as precisely and as necessarily constrictive as possible. You need to kind of steelman your Keegan Stage. Oh no, steelman is the wrong word. You have to kind of steelman it and then contract it, and then steelman it and then contract it. and be happy to be settled with it, and have you can have various lines in the sand as well where the steel mans were before, and you can maybe try to refine that kind of steel mesh. I'm mixing metaphors poetically slightly, but that it basically, just so that you can forget about it. You really need to forget about Keegan Stage 2. It's not going to help you grow up. And in some sense, that's what I want to say mostly to these people, is grow the fuck up. Like, really. It is deplorable and disgusting, the level of trickery and heuristic abuse and, sort of the reliance on Occam's razor, in sort of hideous naked grabs of and groping towards some kind of excuse as to one's lack of integrity. I mean, like, that's fine to use Occam's razor in morally neutral questions or in realms of your life in which you're not capable of experimenting and you're not capable of growing as an individual, because you have to have a roof over your head and you have to do your job. And you have to do your job, within some kind of integrity. And I would say that that integrity needs, if you're doing the job of something, if you're render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, follow the rules that are latent. Like, do you not follow the thread of integrity? I mean, like, what does an employment contract look like? You don't own your labor in an employment contract, and the only thing that defends you is your job description. So if you don't want to do something, put it in your fucking job description. Make it patent. Make it a contractual negotiation. Do it above board. But anyway, if you have the luxury to do so. But the but essentially, I mean, why are you trying to integrate your whole life to be coherent and consistent with a target that it seems, so I mean, it seems like the pretense of integrity and Keegan Stage 4 systematicity is more important than the actual uh, well, if I can get away with everyone respecting me as if I have Keegan Stage 4, then that means that I might as well have Keegan Stage 4. Because I've found a den of snakes that have the same twist in the tail. So, yeah, I mean, this is what happens when you give over your Keegan Stage 3 essentially to a kind of collective, well, what's this latest phrase? Um, Self-organizing collective intelligence. Oh my God, it's like the movie. Uh, Man, this is embarrassing. I can't even remember the name of the movie. Body Snatchers or something. Might as well be taken over by parasitic aliens that control your brain. Or what's that other interesting movie from like the 70s? I'm thinking of the second one. Oh, that's so embarrassing. But anyway, that I don't think that was Aliens. Uh, I need to watch that movie again. I remember it was psychologically prescient in some way. Um, that's interesting. So maybe what's happening then is their unconscious dominant function is stuck in a kind of fixed ideation with their own Keegan stage 4 sort of structure, which has co opted the latter half of Keegan stage 3, or the latter half of the unconscious, from the parent function to the ego's dominant function, all the way through that series. And then the dominant function is kind of enslaved by the ideological umbrella symbolized by the Keegan stage 4, which is colonizing the upper half of the unconscious side of the mind, which is Keegan stage 3. So sort of Keegan stage 4 is extending itself down into Keegan stage 3 and subsuming it. And the dominant function in the unconscious side of the mind must have some weird, in in some sense it must be both enslaved by the subconscious dominant function, and in that enslavement the unconscious dominant function is giving it up over to be a resonant channel of, or a reflection of the Keegan stage 4 subsumption. So in some sense the Keegan stage 3 dominant function in the unconsciousness is being used only as a receptor for the subconscious dominant function. It's working in reverse. In some sense, they've got an unconscious dominant function. They've got an unconscious nemesis, which they are using as a reflection of their Keegan stage 4, and that is the hopscotch sort of thing, that their subconscious dominant function is hopscotching the Keegan stage 3 unconscious side of the mind by just making the whole unconscious side of the mind, or at least the dominant function, a reflection of the rest of the unconsciousness, which is in some sense that criticalness is in the parent function of the unconscious side of the mind, which is essentially working in reverse. It's going from the dominant function in the ego, or even the parent function of the ego, is everything is in essentially, even from the unconscious dominant function to the parent function of the ego, it's all just a reflection of the parent function, but being expressed on a different layer, on a different level. And where that breaks down the worst is the dominant function in the unconscious side of the mind, because it's just completely fucking insane. It doesn't make any sense on that level of deconstruction. And then that nonsensicalness is then just kind of the play that Keegan stage 2 is engaging in. So they are literally engaged in a toxic elaboration of their subconscious dominant function. And in some sense, you could say that their subconscious parent function is probably completely off the chain. It's probably completely unbridled. That their unconscious parent function, therefore, has actually colonized. No, well, okay. The subconscious parent function is actually in a very strange place, because it's doing two things in the absolute. It's like literally bipolar. It's torn in half. That essentially it is conducting the fact that everything above that parent function is just in conformity in some sense with the parent function of the ego, and that it is being the intercessor and is translating all of those layers to the subconscious, and it does not, and in some sense it knows that between the input and the output there is a serious huge amount of cognitive dissonance, and it just doesn't give a fuck. The dominant function in the subconscious does not give a fuck because it will, I mean, it's like a 7 year old, it's a narcissist. I mean, it's like a 7 year old child that never grew up. It's frozen in a developed arrest, in arrested development, but essentially because the dominant function in the unconscious can only be empowered by the parent function of the subconscious, has to allow the inferior function and the sin of the subconscious to let go. In some sense, in what's happened is that the inferior function in the subconscious never became a toxic pill. It always became an internal problem to be circumvented. So basically, these are people that have just never integrated their inferior function. Um, just to make a scriptural reference here, this is connected, the inferior function in the subconscious is corresponded to the Church of Philadelphia, uh, as is spoken about in Revelations, and that the parent function is correspondent to the Church of Sardis, the subconscious parent function. And the subconscious dominant function is the fourth church, which I can't remember the name. I think it's Thyrea or something, Thyatira or something. Thyatira, Thytira. I think it's spelled. I might be wrong. Um, anyway,